In a recent video, I went over some of the most underrated ways to boost your damage in Destiny 2. And to my surprise, a lot of people found that video useful and weren't aware of how all the sources worked together. With damage being a bigger issue for teams during day 1 raids and even in master raid clears, making sure your team is getting the most out of a damage phase is becoming super important. And the only way to do that is to know what you should and should not be using. Yo, what's going on guys? It's G Miners here, and in this video, I'm going to be going over the best damage stacking methods currently in Destiny 2, along with some alternative options so that you can choose what is best for your team and see where that ranks up against some of the other best damage setups that are currently in the game. Some options are going to seem way stronger than others, but there are hidden things that might make certain buffs and debuffs not worth using, and then other options that might seem really weak end up being super easy to implement and add bonuses that you might not be aware of. If you guys do enjoy this video and want to support the channel, dropping a like and sub helps me out a ton, and it only takes 2 seconds. Now with that said, let's get into buff stacking in Season 18 of Destiny 2. There's going to be a link to this exact spreadsheet down below, which has everything you could ever want on one page when it comes to stacking damage. This is where I always go to check for values and other important information. If you guys go to the third tab at the bottom and then scroll down a bit, you're going to see this section, which shows all of the game's current buffs and debuffs. Looking at the buffs first, you're going to see 4 main tiers. These go from tier 1 at the smallest to tier 4 at the highest, and they're going to range from 20% all the way to 40%. The way buffs are going to work inside of Destiny is that anytime this is going to be applied to you, you're going to get a percentage increase in the damage you deal with all weapons. Now, there are also buffs that increase ability damage, but the buffs we are looking at in today's video and in most cases are only going to be for weapons. Up at the tier 3 and tier 4 range, however, a lot of these options are extremely situational, even though they are the best. Gear Falcons and Burning Steps are short durations and only work on Hunters and Titans. Argent Ordnance only provides 1 shot at its full damage potential, and then things like Banner Shield require 1 player to just not deal damage so you can buff the rest of your team. So just because buffs are large by default doesn't mean they are always going to be the best option. Debuffs, on the other hand, tend to be a bit better overall. These apply to an enemy and then increase the damage that this enemy takes from all sources. So rather than just making our weapons hit harder, now anything we use just does more damage. You really tend to either use a weaken debuff, which is going to be 30%, or a tier 2 debuff, which is 30%. Now, the important thing to note with buffs and debuffs is that only one of each can be used at any given time. If you end up trying to use 2 debuffs, the better debuff will be the only one that counts, and the exact same thing works for a buff. So at this point, just for argument's sake, if we ended up taking the best buff and the best debuff, we're going to be dealing 40% more weapon damage and make enemies take 30% more damage overall. The way this works out is that both the 40% and the 30% are just linear increases to our damage. So we multiply our base damage by 1.4 and then 1.3 to see that we are now getting a 1.82x damage increase, otherwise known as an 82% increase in total. Now that you guys know how these work, we are going to get into the best stacking setups along with some other sources that also stack with the buffs and debuffs to let this 82% get even higher. First things first, let's take a look back at the buffs we have and go over what is going to be most practical to use while still giving us a solid increase, aka what is meta. This is going to come down to 3 major factors, which are how long the buff lasts, how well we can use it during a damage phase overall, and then how much of an increase we are also getting. As many people are aware, the best option overall for a buff is going to be Well of Radiance. This is a decent 25% buff. Placing Well is as easy as hitting 1 button. You get a damage buff for the whole 30 seconds that Well lasts, and you are practically invincible when dealing damage. The only buff that I would say is going to be better is the buff provided by Lumina. This is a 35% buff, as you can see in the tier 3 section, and the reason I say this is the only better buff is because all other options are extremely situational. Lumina just requires kills, and then it can be applied to the entire team for 10 seconds whenever you choose to use it. In endgame content, I don't think Lumina is worth running, but if you are running a normal raid and just trying to bake bosses, then it definitely helps. So just as a recap, Well of Radiance is going to be the best option. If you want to get more damage, you should still run a Well of Radiance and then add Lumina to get 10 seconds of increased damage from the Blessing of the Sky buff, which is, again, 10% higher than Well. And then as an honorable mention, if Well is not a viable option because a damage phase requires you to be mobile, like with Rolk, then High Energy Fire is going to be a perfect alternative for only 5% less damage. Debuff wise, I would say in most cases, you are going to want to be on Divinity. This is a 30% debuff, so you get the largest benefit of all the debuffs, and your damage becomes more consistent as it becomes easier to hit crits with the cage that it provides. On top of this, there is no other debuff in the game that even comes close to lasting as long as Divinity does without needing to reapply something. So as far as ease of use goes, nothing comes close to being easier than Div. The only time where I would say Divinity is not worth running is when you have less than 6 people, like in a dungeon, or if you are against a boss where the crit bubble might not help and shorter debuffs last for the entire damage phase. Caretaker is a somewhat decent example of this. I think the crit bubble is in an awful spot and you can't hit it with something like linears easily. So if you manage to just apply weaken grenades and other smaller debuffs, your damage would technically come out slightly higher because you do get one extra person to deal damage rather than using Divinity. But this is only in cases where you want to absolutely bake bosses and know that Div is not going to be good. So in almost every case where you are learning a new raid or are running casually, Divinity is going to 100% be the go-to. After this is where our damage starts to get wild. In Destiny, there are 2 amplification mods which are going to stack on top of each other, and buffs and debuffs which make our damage even better. First up is going to be Font of Might. This is going to increase weapon damage by 25% and is like having a whole other Well of Radiance to buff your damage again. The only downside is that you do need to synergize your weapon damage type with your subclass type and the elemental wells you create. Most teams tend to use this on Stasis, which I have an entire build and video explaining why if you want to check that out. But in short, Stasis ended up being the easiest to proc Font of Might in a damage phase, and Reed's Regret is currently one of the best DPS options, so using Font of Might with both of these is just a no-brainer. After Font of Might, we get an additional 10% from the mod Power of Rasputin. The way this mod works is that anytime an enemy is near a Warmind cell, you are going to deal 10% more damage to them. Power of Rasputin can also be combined with one player running Grasp of the Warmind, so you can actually pick up and stick this to enemies or just place it near where they are standing, which makes it way more practical for damage phases. And these last 20 seconds, which is going to double the duration of something like Lumina, which is also technically just a 10% increase from Well of Radiance. So in my opinion, if you do need the extra 10%, Power of Rasputin is the way to go. With Well of Radiance at 25%, Divinity at 30%, Font at 25%, and Power of Rasputin at 10%, we are going to go from base damage all the way up to a 2.23x damage increase. This is going to be 123% more damage, so we're dealing over double what we normally would. And if you do have one player on Lumina, this would add 10% more to the combo, which brings us up to 2.46x. This is, in my opinion, the current best damage stacking method in Destiny 2, and keep in mind this is without any raid mods or any other specific exotic armor pieces that buff individual damage. This is the best because of the ease of use you get from the system, and because if you do decide that certain mods like Font of Might and Power of Rasputin are too hard for your current team to use, you can always just not use them. Let me know if this video helped you guys out in the comments below, and make sure to drop by my stream over on Twitch if you guys want to watch me do some speedruns and some low mans live. We do also have a Discord server if you guys want to join that and the community we have over there. Anyways, have a good one, guys. Peace.